Let me please segue into the next part of our event because we are so lucky to have Jennifer Jones-Austin with us today. Jennifer is the CEO and Executive Director of FPWA, which is really one of New York's leading anti-poverty policy and advocacy nonprofits with 170 plus, I believe, member organizations. And Jennifer is really a lifelong advocate for social justice here in New York City. So Jennifer, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm disappointed that I didn't get to hear all of the last panel, but the little bit I did hear, I heard some really great ideas.
That's great. Well, there won't be a pop quiz on all the good ideas we've heard so far, but we would love to get some of yours. I mean, as you probably heard, really the second half of that panel was really focused on driving an equitable and inclusive recovery. And I don't want to restate all the reasons why we should be concerned, but we certainly see how this pandemic has had such a disproportionate impact on folks with lower levels of educational attainment, who have been who have experienced decades of disinvestment in their communities. And now we're poised to have an economic recovery that does not, as Seth put it, lift all boats. And we need to do quite a few things, I would say, about that. And we'd love to hear your thoughts about some of those things. So let me start with your priorities for the next administration and the next city council. We see this as a real moment of opportunity for New York. As I mentioned earlier, there is perhaps almost universal consensus that the economic recovery that we are cultivating needs to foreground equity. But I don't know that there's anything close to consensus around what that would actually look like, let alone what are those specific things that elected officials and other policymakers should actually do to accomplish that. So I'd love to get your thoughts, Jennifer. I mean, policy change is really where the rubber meets the road. And by that measure, there's a lot of work to do. So rather than just a laundry list, I want to start with, where do you begin? How do you prioritize for the city's incoming leaders about building or rebuilding a more equitable city?
So I'm going to begin with a little bit of a personal share. Years ago, I've been married now for nearly 28 years. And at one point in my marriage, my husband and I were struggling, and we went to see a therapist. And the therapist sat with us, and she said, here's the deal. She said, I'll work with you for about 6 weeks. She said, but I'm going to tell you at the outset, there are 3 types of people in this world. She said, there are people who don't acknowledge that a problem exists. She then went on to say, there are some people who acknowledge the problem, but say, yeah, it is what it is, and it's just going to be that way. She said, and then there's the third person who says, I see a problem, I acknowledge it, I own it, and I really want to work to do something with it. Well, clearly my husband and I fell into that third category of persons who see problems, like to work on them, and try to get beyond them. New York City needs to fall in that third category. And I begin with saying that to fall in that third category, we have to be honest. We talk a lot about the policies, the programs, the initiatives that we should undertake, and we do very little to talk about what actually has birthed and perpetuated inequity in this society and in this nation. Here in this city, we birth and perpetuate poverty at every turn by essentially doing, multiple things. We allow a system to persist where racism, capitalism, and militarism all work in concert to continually oppress people of color, Black persons, indigenous persons, and other persons of color. And until we as a city and a nation are honest about that we are continually propping up a system that uses racism as a tool to keep certain people from having not, right? From not having, I should say, that uses militarism, uses policing and law enforcement as a tool to continually oppress people, all in an effort to ensure that some people have and others do not, we're not going to get anywhere. So that's where I begin with this city, this nation, this incoming mayor needs to be honest about how inequity is propped up and perpetuated in this system. And if you want me to give you 2 examples just to jump right in.
Love it.
The first one that I'll give to you is how we measure poverty. Right? So just recently, last week, the federal poverty measures came out, and people were jumping up and down saying that we had lowered poverty in America. And maybe we even saw some change in New York City. All buying into a falsehood. 2 falsehoods. One, that we don't accurately measure poverty to begin with. That we undercount who is poor in America. We undercount who is poor in New York City. And then we use the income supports. And last year, and this year I should say, looking at the federal poverty measure, we used the economic stimuli numbers, the stimulus check. We used food supports. We used unemployment, supplemental unemployment insurance, all supporting people in need, and said, look, we we've lowered poverty. No, we didn't. We temporarily helped people to get by. And the rationale behind that, the reasoning was, if they didn't do better, then the society on the whole wouldn't do better. So how do we address inequity in New York City and the nation? We begin by accurately measuring what it costs to live in this city. The federal poverty measure says that a family of four, anywhere in America, needs just $26,500 to get by. What we know, using the self-sufficiency standard, which is a standard that was created by the Women's Center for Welfare out of the University of Washington, we know that here in New York City, that a mother with two children, two young children, needs at least $81,000 to cover her expenses. But yet, we in New York City go along with the federal poverty measure and we say, wow, if she just has $21,000, she's doing okay. Maybe we need to use, 200% of the federal poverty measure to give her some child care, maybe give her some housing subsidies. But we still know that that's not covering her basic costs. So let's stop lying as a city and as a nation about what it really takes to help address the needs of people who are struggling, what it takes to really make ends meet in America. So adopt the self-sufficiency standard. Begin there this next mayoral administration. Adopt the self-sufficiency standard and then align your policies and your programs around child care, health care subsidies, housing subsidies, transportation subsidies. Align your policies around that. That's one place I would begin. Align your wages around that. Who you're going to do business with, what your contracts with labor look like. Align your policies around the self-sufficiency standard. That's one place where you could begin, where we could begin.
So let me ask you kind of a follow-up about that then, Jennifer. I mean, when we look at the last few years before the pandemic, even based on New York City's poverty standard, which is higher than the federal, but lower than what you're describing, we saw that slowly but fairly steadily the poverty rate had been ticking down. It's still by any measure unacceptably high. You're looking at almost 1 in 5 New Yorkers even before the pandemic, and obviously it's worsened. And if you take out those short-term wage subsidies or short-term cash infusions. But I want to ask you not just about kind of diagnosing the problem, but kind of really looking at what those solutions would be. So it seems like one potential challenge is, well, first of all, understanding why did poverty go down? I mean, part of it is that we had record high job growth. Part of it is certainly that the minimum wage increased in New York City to $15, arguably not close to enough to be, to sustain a family, but a big gain from where we were, 10 years ago. And now we've seen, of course, that so many of those jobs that while they maybe only paid $15 an hour, they were still a key floor to get on the path to family self-sufficiency, at least in some cases. But those jobs disproportionately are the ones that have been lost and have been so slow to rebound. As I mentioned earlier, we still see that employment in hospitality, for example, is 35% below where it was. So I guess the question I have is, on the one hand, it seems like there's a widespread frustration with low-wage work in New York and in America right now. Folks are not clamoring necessarily to return to the workforce, and we see that all over the country, and we see it right here in New York. And all you have to do is ask a small business owner about hiring right now, and you hear stories about that. At the same time, obviously not having a job and certainly having an economy with nearly 500,000 fewer jobs means that there's far less pressure to keep wages up and keep them rising. So I guess I'm curious from your perspective, how do you address that issue around low wage work? I mean, do we need to really prioritize bringing those jobs back, period? Because at least that creates a floor. Do we need to entirely focus on building pathways to better paying, better quality jobs? How do you strike that balance at such a pivotal moment right now? And what would you suggest to the city's incoming leaders?
Well, the first thing that we need to do is we do need to look at how we grow wages. But again, I come back to, we're not as a society going to grow wages and pay people fairly and honestly if we have a federal poverty measure and a federal minimum wage that says it's $7.25 an hour. If we have a New York City wage, a New York State wage that says it's $15 an hour, but we know that that's not enough. So you have to look at and be honest about the gap between the self-sufficiency standard, what it really costs to live in New York City, and what wages are needed. The other thing that I'll submit to you is that what we've seen here in New York City and other places is we use various income supports to help supplant that minimum wage and suggest that we're doing better than we really are. That's why it looks like poverty is going down, but it's not going down because it's not an honest measure. If we do not begin with the fact that it's not an honest measure, then we're going to be dishonest in the solutions that we bring to the table. So yes, we need to grow wages. We need to look at wage suppression for specific jobs. You know, we know in this society that when it comes to black and brown women, that the jobs that they hold, you know, in the main, lower income jobs, we've suppressed those wages. We don't value that work. We engage in job segregation. We also know that for black persons in particular, even when they try to get ahead and get college degrees and graduate degrees that put them in a position of earning more, they still are earning less. A black woman with a master's degree on average earns less than a white man with a high school diploma. So let's not talk about equity if we're not talking about racism and how racism is used as a tool to continually prop up this system where some have and others do not. We can talk about all the policies in the world, but if we don't change our structural underpinnings that allow for wage suppression, that allow us to say that some people earning $15 an hour are doing better. Poverty went down in New York City because the wage went up by $1 or $2 for some people, but it didn't really materially change their circumstances. Let's be honest about that. So again, my policy change, structural and policy, would be you begin with honoring the self-sufficiency standard, what it costs for people to live in New York City, and then you build policies off of that. You fund at higher rates the child care subsidy. Here in New York City, we have a huge gap between people who should be receiving a child care subsidy and who actually are. And that's because we're basing it off of a federal poverty measure and a supplemental poverty measure here in New York City. If we're honest and we begin with what it really costs to live, then we'll do right by funding adequately child care subsidies, housing subsidies, fair fare subsidies, transportation subsidies, and so on. That's where I begin. And I can't get off of that. You may want me to get off of that, but if you don't fix the root, then any policies are just Band-Aids on top of it. And we need to stop playing this game and buying into this. That's the God's honest truth. And a lot of people don't want to hear that, but that's the truth. And the other thing that we need to do is stop criminalizing the poor. In this city, the correlation between the communities with the highest rates of incarceration and the communities of poor and low and persons of color is too great. The correlation is too great to be ignored. We are using criminalization, militarizing, the system to work against black and brown people intentionally. Because you know what? If I come in and I surveil you, so much, then I'm going to find something that I'm not finding in other places. And if I can arrest you and send you to jail, send you to prison, then when you come out, you're now not going to be able to get a good paying job. You may not be eligible for a Pell Grant, and it just perpetuates the cycle. We have to honestly look at what's at the core here. Maybe I'm talking critical race theory here, and maybe some like it and some don't, but we are living critical race theory in action. And if we do not upend these structural laws and policies and systems, every policy we put on top is just a Band-Aid approach. So let's get to the real work. Let's be honest about it, and then let's have our policies align with the real effort. That's my take.
Listen, I really appreciate that, Jennifer. I think I want to, challenge you even though to help me figure out 4 policymakers, some of whom are listening right now, who many of whom may agree with every single word you said, but to think about, as a starting point, and to say that, well, then there's certainly one clear implication, which is changing how the city, continuing to refine and adapt how the city defines poverty, which makes sense. But then I just want to ask you about, moving beyond that, and we only have a little bit of time left, but for those policymakers that are then looking for, okay, I'm with you, and we can do that, but then what?
Okay.
I'd love to get your thoughts about how you prioritize with such a huge set of interconnected structural problems. How do you prioritize things that the city and individual city leaders can actually help to change?
So the first thing that you do is you look at what you can do. I don't know if felt like my mic was off. I was like, did they silence me? The first thing that you have to do is begin with the wages, what it really costs for people to live. And you have to think about how as a city, we don't want people to be internally, beholden to policies, income supports. So how do we grow wages? We have to look at wage suppression in certain jobs, home health aides, childcare, and what have you. And we have to negotiate wages that really help people to make ends meet. So I would also look at, as a city, if I was leading the city and engaging in economic development, I would look at, when I'm building contracts and negotiating contracts, are the people who I'm looking to contract with going to pay self-sufficient wages? That would be one policy area where I would look. The second thing that I would do, building off of the self-sufficiency standard, would be that I would look at how I fund, if I was leading the city, how to fund income supports that really meet the needs of every New Yorker. Not just those who are at 100% of poverty or those who are at 200% of poverty, but those who are at 400% of poverty, because they also need, right? So I would look at, how do I make sure that the income support programs that we are running in New York City are meeting the needs of people who are struggling, not just at 100% of poverty or 200% below, but at 300, 400%. Then I'd look at, what do we do about wage suppression and wage inequity, pay inequity, and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that people who should be earning more actually are earning more, and that anybody discriminating against Black and brown persons when it comes to their wages are held accountable. So those are some of the things that I would do.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. We're not going to unpack all of these challenges today, but I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Folks, join me in a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.